Hello again. My name is Myrto Stamatopoulou. I am a PhD researcher. I'm coming from Greece. I'm based in Athens, but right now, I'm in Belgium, in Antwerp. I'm doing a PhD internship and I'm a visiting lecturer in the University of St. Lucas here in the Department of Photography. So, yes, I'm very happy to be with you today and give you this presentation. So let me show.
Yes, now we can see it.
Can you see it in a big size, right?
Yes,
Good, great,
wonderful.
great. So let me start. Visual narratives of death, the memorial postmortem photography in Greece, mid 20 until mid 19 until mid 20th century. The memorial postmortem photography is the photographic representation of a person after their death in order to preserve their memory. The deceased is usually photographed in their house or during the religious ceremony that takes place before the burial. Post-mortem photography was a significant part of the ritual of the end of life and was evolved in the 19th century as an outgrowth of Romanticism, which is reflected in characteristics such as melancholy and emotional exaggeration. One of the key roles that such a photograph had was to console the grief of the relatives that left behind, while at the same time was used to verify the death to relatives that were far away. But most significantly, it offered the possibility to the people left behind to keep the memory of the deceased alive in their minds. The post-mortem photographs included in this study depict people who were photographed either at indoors or outdoor spaces. The photograph was taken during the funeral, I'm sorry, or a little earlier when friends and relatives were paying their last respects. Post-mortem portraiture started as a habit at the same time with the discovery of photography, flourished enormously in the following decades, firstly in the northern European countries, such as England, Belgium, and France, and later this practice was spread in several countries across Europe, among them Greece as well. One of the first photographic depictions in general that was ever made was the photograph of a dead person. In October 1839, shortly after the official presentation of the invention of photography, sent a sample French doctor Alfred Donnet, experimenting with the new technique of daguerreotype, sent a sample of his images to the French Academy of Sciences. In his letter, he wrote, I have the honor to send you some new images made by the daguerreotype method, which I have submitted as first test to the Academy. I have already achieved a great result by drawing the image of a dead man. Unfortunately, no trace of this daguerreotype has been found. At the beginning of the 19th century, people did not comprehend death as a macabre reality as it is today, but as an inevitable, expected, and even welcome condition in the cycle of life. Photographing a dead child was very common during that era, although completely incomprehensible to the viewer of today. The first depiction of the deceased children were daguerreotypes, such as the one we see here at the right side. Many of these pictures were created in the middle of the 19th century and were placed in daguerreotype cases to be kept as sentimental mementos. Most time, children were depicted in the arms or lap of their parents, who were looking directly at the camera with apathy, possibly due to the grieving process. It is important to make it clear what exactly a memorial postmortem photography is. Postmortem as a photographic genre hardly fits into any of the known photographic categories such as photojournalism, still life, nude, etc. And although it mainly depicts the human figure, it can hardly be included in portrait photography, documentary photography, or vernacular photography, where people are the main subject. In literature, it is referred to as postmortem photography, postmortem portrait, or final portrait. That new trend of capturing the deceased through the camera evolved the way it did due to several reasons. First of all, it was the religious beliefs of the time, meaning that people believed that the deceased was not dead, but was entering an afterlife. That's the reason why the dead people was depicted as to be asleep. Secondly, the existing atmosphere of familiarity with death, which was very intense during 19th century. Children were taught that death was the passage to a better world, where they would meet their departed loved ones. Photographing the deceased also started as a need of capturing the facial characteristics of people who passed away, and the relatives wanted to keep their memory alive and the picture as a souvenir. As a photographic and social practice, it must be seen and interpreted under the light of social beliefs around death and mourning of that time. And most times it reflected the expectations of the relatives of the deceased, which were related with religious beliefs about an eternal life in heaven. Apart from the meanings and the significance a death portrait could have, it was a good opportunity for the photographers to show their artistic skills as well. The atmospheric postmortem photograph of Queen Olga on her deathbed shows that the photographer of the time had, apart from the technical training, some aesthetic education as well. The evocative natural light that dominates the bedroom, which is full of religious images, yes, gives the composition a special meaning and emphasizes further the tragic event of her death. Moreover, the decorative elements and symbol of death that can be seen around in her room, such as the cross, flowers, and occasionally religious images, make up a universal death narrative. In the death portrait of Greek poet Kostis Palamas, that we see here on the right, the photographer also tried to create an artistic postmortem photography, staging the dead body in such a position that the natural light could add some aesthetic value on the photograph. In the early years of photography, very few people owned a photographic portrait of themselves. The new form of depiction was not yet widespread among the majority of people, and the only possible way for a portrait was a painting, like the one we see here from the 17th century. At the dawn of photography, a new opportunity appeared in terms of capturing the facial characteristics of the deceased loved ones. That was the time postmortem photography was born. During that time, such a photograph tended to be both the first and their last portrait, which was kept by the relatives as souvenir. It was mostly a family heirloom that helped preserving their memory of the dead. It's important to mention that the tradition of postmortem photography started and thrived during the Victoria era. But before photography was invented, jewelry making was the usual mourning tradition, and such jewelry used to be worn as sentimental mementos, as the one we see here on the right side, which is a jewelry with hair braids of the deceased. During the Victoria era, death rituals and mournings customs were widely accepted and were a way of paying respects to the deceased loved ones. In England, the United States, and Canada, a whole industry of dealing with death was established early on, including specific clothing and accessories for mourning. pins and jewelry made from the hair of the dead, as I mentioned before, special objects for embalming bodies, and mourning-related attitudes. At this point, it's interesting to watch a modern photograph from Henri Cartier-Bresson that depicts the Japanese female mourners in the funeral of a kabuki actor. This photograph can be considered as photojournalism and differs a lot from the mourning photos that we saw in the previous slide, which was a picture for private use most possibly. The melancholic atmosphere is intensified by the contrast and the meticulous composition, which draws the viewer into the private grief of the people around. There are three main categories of postmortem photography, which can be found in all countries where the practice of postmortem photography was a reality. These main categories, more or less, can also be found in Greece. The first of these categories suggests that the deceased person is not dead, but is sleeping, and that's why it's called the last sleep. As a pictorial convention, the last sleep carries a sentiment towards death that dominated the Victorian era. According to the ideology of the time, death didn't occur. People didn't really die. They just went to sleep. That's the reason why we can see a pillow underneath the head of the deceased, as it is a necessary accessory to let them rest. The last sleep pattern is strongly related to the ancient Greek gods Thanatos, which mean death, and Hypnos, which mean sleep, the twin sons of night in Greek mythology. It also foreshadows the eternal life that awaits man after his material end. The iconographic references to the relationship between death and sleep are numerous, but many more are the literary references, which are truly countless and run through the cultural heritage of the Western culture from antiquity until the present day. From Homer to modern Greek literature, death is often described as sleep, and the connection between the two is traced to this day. In Iliad, Homer described the transfer of the almost dead Sarpedon to his homeland Lycia by Hypnos and Thanatos, the terrible gods as Hesiod calls them. And with celestial robes adorn the dead, those rites discharged, his sacred course bequeath, to the soft arms of silent sleep and death. They to his friend the immortal charge shall bear. That is the exact same scene that was drawn on a vase, as we can see here in the picture. It's interesting to mention that Sarpedon, although mortally wounded by Patroclus, is not yet dead, but asleep, and reason for that is that Zeus ensured for Sarpedon that he would firstly meet his beloved ones and then he would pass away. The second category includes the depiction of the deceased in a specific way to make them appear as if they are alive. The American anthropologist J. Ruby gave the title Alive Yet Dead. This category appeared immediately with the beginning of photographic practice and was presented as an idealized representation of the dead. In Greece, this category was applied by rotating the photograph itself 90 degrees upwards to give the illusion of a living person. This deceptive photographic practice usually took place at the stage of prothesis, which is the public display of the dead person for his last farewell, that took place the day after their death. At that moment, the photographer would take the picture of the dead in such a way that it would appear they had not died, but was just sleeping. Another way that this category was practiced was posing the dead with open eyes. This is not a common practice in Greece that leads us to assume that this result was a product of luck, as we can see here on the picture on the right side of the slide. Here we see a child having his eyes half open and not completely open, as it used to be in such cases. In Northern Europe and America, the dead person was posed with open eyes or positioned in a sitting pose as to appear alive, giving a more macabre result, we could say. Back in the day, child mortality rates were very high. Child and infant mortality was significantly higher in 1910 than it is today. In the late 19th century, Asian cholera, yellow fever, typhus, and plague skyrocketed mortality rates in the modernized nation of Europe and North America. These diseases were so dangerous that they caused mortality levels that were by today's standard frighteningly high. Similarly, the loss of many infants from unknown and undefined causes were generally accepted as a fatal consequences of fate, sorry. These facts led many people, especially parents, to take this kind of pictures as we see here, ensuring them a photo of their lost child as if it was still alive. Those two photos that we see here depicts children that looks to be alive. On the left side, we see the girl that sits on the armchair holding her doll, and her eyes are closed, but he looks like to be an alive child. The picture on the right is even more macabre, I could say, because we see the open eyes of that young boy. The third main category is the funeral photography, which is the most common type in Greece. This group photograph was taken during the transferring of the deceased to the burial place. This photographic type consists of the dead person surrounded by close family members or by members of the wider community. Around the deceased is a crowd of people, adults, children, and priests. A special feature of the photograph is that almost all the participants in the scene are looking towards the dead. Only the priests and the little boy in the foreground on the left are looking at the photographer. The women are facing towards the dead man, probably at the photographer's command, with intense sadness on their faces. In this slide, we can see two different types of photographs that belong to the same category. The left one is taken inside of a house, and the participants are also looking towards the deceased person. On the contrary, the photo on the right is taken outdoors, and the participants, a group of young students, are looking towards the camera. In any case, the participants were following the photographer's instruction. Although the main use of postmortem photography for many decades was that of a souvenir, its first and primary role was the documentation of death and the identification of the deceased. For that reason, postmortem photography has been used several times as a tool of documentation, as we can see in these photos from the burning of Smyrna and the Balkan Wars. Although the majority of postmortem photographs were used inside a private circle of people, photographs of dead famous persons were often published in the press. Greece, being in a constant and fierce political rivalry, had many opposing political newspapers, and the message they delivered to the reader varied according to the politics of the publisher, especially when the deceased was a politician or a governor. As Roland Barthes says in his book Image, Music, Text, the meaning of a photograph varies according to the type of publication in which it is published. Such a case is the postmortem photograph of King George I after his assassination in Thessaloniki in 1913. This solo portrait, which was published in the press, was intended not only to inform the world about King's death, but also to emphasize his virtues, calling him the most benign and democratic king. Now we can go a little bit further with a look at the individual post-mortem portraits. The solo or individual portraits give the chance for a closer look to the face of the deceased. The brutality of death, which can be seen through the lifeless body and face of the deceased, appears very obvious in these photographs. In these pictures, the deceased person is the only protagonist. The solo portraits are the last and often the only portrait of the dead. Was also used so that the family members could keep the memory alive of their loved ones. Moreover, such photographs were used to certify that the death of a person to the relatives that lived far away. Many photographs were pasted in a carte postale in order to be sent to the family members that lived far away. In the picture we see here, it's important to mention that in the back side of the photograph there is a handwriting text that says the young Spiridoula Eleni, that girl we see on the left side, who died in Ioannina in 1922, August 8th. This text, I believe, that makes the photograph even more sentimental. The feeling that the viewer has in front of a portrait is also a matter of which angle the portrait is made. The three-quarter angle most times can give such an artistic effect, as this position allows the photographer to capture almost the entire face. At the same time, this angle makes the portrait more atmospheric, because the side lighting can add the necessary volume to the lifeless face. These two individual portraits we see here are a very good example of this category. Both are close-ups of the upper body of the person, hands included most times, as we see in the child portrait on the right. The fruits we see inside the coffin of the old lady in the photograph in the left side represent the cycle of life, death and rebirth. The most common viewing angle to capture an individual post-mortem portrait was from the side of the body so that the face could be seen in profile pose. This particular shot served two purposes. Firstly, the photographer could conceal possible signs of decomposition, and secondly, it gives the impression of a peaceful sleep rather than death. The portrait on the left side has been found in the Jewish archives of the state in the island of Corfu and belongs to an unknown man. It is really weird to see such a photograph among the Jewish people, as the Jewish tradition does not allow the dead people to be seen at all, let alone to take photographs of them. The portrait on the right belongs to an unknown young child in the late 19th century. We don't know what the child holds in their hands, but it's possible that this is a kind of a prayer or a part from the Bible. This is the only photograph I've seen until now that the dead person holds a piece of paper in his hands. The facing forward pose is quite unusual among the Greek death portraits and is mostly seen in the Northern European countries. The portrait on the right, although is taken in Greece, was created by an Italian photographer called Bartolomeo Bori, and it's quite possible that the photographer might have brought the customs from abroad to the Greek society. The young boy from Belgium we see at the left has been captured in a full body frame with his hands crossed with a rosary in between. Another characteristic that makes it clear for the viewer that this is indeed a dead child are the two bricks that have been placed under his armchair in order to prevent the boy from falling off it. Both children that we see here hold either the rosary or flowers in their hands as symbols of resurrection. In such photographs, the details of the face can be seen very clearly, and this might cause some inconvenience to the viewer, as most times the face of the deceased had visible marks of death. Although the unfast death portraits may sometimes shock the viewer, they are quite interesting because they show directly the truthfulness of death. The loss of a person always causes pain and grief, but the tragedy of death is even greater when it is a young person or a young woman. The unmarried deceased woman is a special category in postmortem photography. As Simone de Beauvoir says in her book The Second Sex, the fate that society traditionally reserves for the women is marriage. Even today, most women are married, have been or about to be married, or are suffering because they are not married. Whether or not a woman is married determines not only her life but also the death ritual that follows her pass away. Unmarried dead women used to be dressed in wedding dresses, and some of them even had a white bridal veil on their heads. The young woman that is laid down in her coffin in this funeral picture from the city of Volos in Greece is a very characteristic photograph of this category. Moreover, the young girl that is looking at her with a scared gaze creates an even more powerful atmosphere. In the next couple of photographs that come from Greece and Bulgaria, the deceased females are dressed with white dresses and flowers on their hair. Both staged scenes of mourning are almost similar. The coffin is surrounded by the family members, which are all dressed in black, the official color of mourning in the Balkan countries. In some photos, like the one on the right, we notice the frame of the picture that decorates the photograph and makes it look like a previous souvenir. The tradition of the unmarried deceased females to be dressed as brides comes from antiquity. The death of a young woman, already in ancient times, was considered a real tragedy, because the most important role of her life, which was to get married and have children, remained unfulfilled. In the funerary reliefs of the classical period, depicting young unmarried women, the so-called virgins, the main iconographic features that identifies them as unmarried daughters is the Attic veil, which is regarded as the exclusive dress for unmarried women. Even today, a deceased young woman dressed as a bride inside the coffin is an absolutely paradox image. This paradox is very well reflected in the grave stele of the 4th century BC of a 12-year-old maiden. Lament instead of a bridal chamber, lament instead of a husband, and tomb instead of marriage. Going on a bit further, we see children post-mortem portraits. These kind of portraits are a very special category, since such an untimely and unnatural death always evokes very strong feelings and questions, and leaves us with a sense of emptiness. Some historical details will help us understand why death portraits of children became very popular during 19th century and early 20th century. During that period, 2 out of 10 children died before being 5 years old. In addition to the diseases affecting the infants themselves, the high mortality rates were also linked to the high mortality rates of their mothers. Many of them died during or shortly after giving birth, and because infants were absolutely dependent on their mother's milk and mother's care, their life was also in danger. The most important cause of mortality in infants and toddlers was infectious diseases, as we mentioned earlier. The death of a child is and always will be an incomprehensible fact. The fact that the person can lose their life so prematurely is a great oddity. One such case is the little girl from Bulgaria that we see here lying dead in all white, in the all white background of her coffin and her clothes. Her death is probably a source of great pain for her family, as the unexpressed sadness in their faces reminds us, once again, of her tragic, untimely death. A very unusual photograph is this one that we see here, depicting the funeral of a very young child. The coffin is being held much higher than usual, so the child can be seen by all the people around. From that period onwards, the deceased stopped being carried in public with open coffins for public hygienic reasons. Another important fact that marked post-mortem photography of the time was the staging of public mourning scenes. More or less, the staging was very similar, both in rural areas and in the cities. The restrained expressions and the mute sadness we see in the faces of the mourners in funeral photographs was the result of the photographic techniques of the time, and it was also the photographer's talent to stage the scene during this direction. We don't know in what way people could express their grief after losing a beloved one. They might have wanted to express themselves in a more extroverted way. Today's viewer sees these people standing beside their deceased loved ones, posing without showing any feelings, and it is hard to imagine that just before or just after the photographer captured the moment, these people may have been grieving loudly. Both funeral photographs are from rural areas in Greece. The mourners in the island of Kythera, in the picture we see on the left, wear white coverings in their heads, while the mourners from the mountain villages of northern Greece, on the right, choose the black color for clothes and head covers to show their mourning. A stage photograph excludes any spontaneous expression of emotions. Let alone that back in those days, camera's shutter speed didn't allow spontaneous posing, and capturing moments of extreme suffering was not an easy task in terms of technical efficiency. On the contrary, in the middle of the 20th century, photographic cameras offered the opportunity for a quicker shutter speed release. The high speed, in addition to the flashlight, offers the opportunity for spontaneous shots, like the one we see here. The expression of the mourners are now obvious at their faces. We can see that kind of intense grief expression to be even more obvious in the widow's face that stands on the right of the picture. In the cities, the stage scenes of public mourning are more or less the same to those of the rural areas. The way the deceased is posed is almost similar, only mourners' dressing codes are quite different. What is important to mention here is that photographing the deceased was a very frequent occupation for professional photographers until the first decades of the 20th century. As we can notice in some of the pictures, the photographers were using a decorative frame and used to sign it as well. There aren't any business records of how much money photographers could gain out of these occupations, but it is most likely they earned good money from this photographic practice. Here we see a large group funeral photograph, which is a unique category, I could say. Death was a good reason for the whole village to gather and say the last goodbye to the deceased. This kind of photographs reflects the structure of relationships and give a different meaning to the idea of community. Leonidas Papazoglou, a significant Greek photographer of the 19th century, captured several funerals with many people of all ages standing around of an open coffin. In the funeral photograph that we see here, the deceased priest is surrounded by more than 90 people, all members of the local community. All of them are looking at the camera as if it is a group photograph of a social event, rather than a funeral photo. In the next photo, we see a snapshot before the funeral of a young student whose coffin is in the courtyard of his school. 53 people, students and teachers, are gathered around the young boy. In the last two photos, this one and the previous one, in the last two photos, the emphasis is given on the community, on the spirit of community, rather than the mourning itself. Although all the people are standing around the dead boy, their faces are turned towards the photographer and not to the deceased themselves, creating a sense of community and solidarity, and act as a meditation between self and society, life and death. What is also a weird fact for today's viewer is that in some photographs we see that children were included in funeral photographs as being the protagonists of the scene. We can presume that those children had lost a parent, and the pain was even bigger if it was the mother who died. In this funeral photograph from the early 20th century, we see two young girls standing in front of the coffin and can easily suggest that the dead woman was their mother. The photographer chooses to pose those girls in the foreground, as their presence is equally important, or even more so, than the death of their mother. We see fear and emptiness on their faces, and can assume that their life will not be the same again after their mother's loss. Here we can see two more interesting pictures of this category. The one on the left comes from Bulgaria and it depicts family members mourning the father's pass. The widow dressed in black, the three children, and the older man are staring with sadness and despair at the deceased young men. In particular, the children look at their father in wonder, possibly thinking what this is all about. A similar case, but even more emotional, can be seen on the right picture. We don't know if the young girl is the daughter of the deceased woman, but she looks towards her in fear and wonder. After having seen all these memorial post-mortem photographs, I would like to show you some photographs that are quite different. They are created only for artistic purposes. The dead human body that has been used quite some times in contemporary photography, especially since the 1970s, when conceptual art had been established. Photographers now occupy themselves with unusual subjects, amongst them death, and are more concerned with their artistic ideas rather than the aesthetic result of their photographs. Photographers such as Jeffrey Silverthrone, Sally Mann, and André Serrano have used dead bodies in their work several times. One of the earliest photographic works featuring corpses is the morgue work by the American photographer Jeffrey Silverthrone that we see here. This work includes 22 large format photographs depicting corpses. The photographs were taken at the Rhode Island State Morgue. In the photograph with the title Lover's Accidental Carbon Monoxide Poisoning that we see here, Silverthrone has captured an unfortunate couple who died from a domestic accident. The two lovers lie on the morgue tables, reminding us how fragile life is. In the morgue, I was looking for my parents, but eventually I found them in my heart years later, says the photographer, and makes us comprehend why he chose such an unusual subject to take photographs of. Serrano's The Morgue differs a lot from Jeffrey's Silverstone morgue work. Color and composition signify Serrano's brightly colored photographs. In The Morgue, Serrano puts the physical dead body in front of our eyes in large-scale close-ups. His work is an antidote to the widespread culture, already prevalent since the late 19th century, of avoiding human mortality and projecting eternal youth. Serrano's The Morgue offer the provocative religious aesthetic of the Baroque artworks. And as the artist says, I consider myself to belong to a tradition of religious art that goes back to Caravaggio and others. One more case of an artist who used the dead human body in their work is the American photographer Sally Mann. In her series of photographs entitled Body Farm, she captures dead bodies in the process of decomposition. The corpses Mann photographed had been placed in the outdoor area of the University of Tennessee's forensic department, where they were left to decompose naturally. After that, they were given to students for study and were used as reference points in forensic and anthropological exams. So, that was it. This is the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you a lot for your attention and your time. Thank you very much. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed it.
I think it was very thought-provoking because this is part of our life, so it is very interesting to think about it and also about the ethics and the aesthetics of how to photograph this topic. So thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you for inviting me as well.
I asked the students if they have a question.
Yes, please.
Are there any other contemporary examples of this kind of work except Salomon and Andres Serrano? Maybe you've seen anything else?
You mean in contemporary photography, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Joel Peter Witkin has also used corpses in his work. I believe you know Witkin, right?
Yeah, sure.
Now I don't have it doesn't come to my mind somebody else rather than Witkin, Mann, Serrano, Silverstone, but I'm sure that there are many more photographers that have photographed dead bodies and used them in their artistic work.
Thank you a lot.
You're welcome.
My question is that where do you do your historical research? Do you have any institution or photography museum where they collect, or where do you find these kind of pictures?
Okay, yes, thank you for the question. Some of the photographs have been gathered from museums and research institutes in Greece and in Athens. Most of them are in Athens, but many of the photographs belong to private collections, and I had to find them by myself. It was a big thing to try to find this kind of photographs, and it was really difficult. Yes, but I did it all by myself. Yes, I was knocking doors, and I was asking for photographs, mouth by mouth, mouth to mouth, and finally I managed to gather about 40 and something photographs. It was not an easy task.
When will you have your defense of your PhD?
Hopefully this summer or autumn. Until October, yes, I believe that I will defend it.
Okay. So then we all wish you good luck with it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for